The ground is cold under his feet, even though the sun has been up for 2 hours. He can feel it through the worn leather of his sandals, that deep chill that never quite leaves the limestone plateau, not even in summer. He is 41 years old, which makes him one of the oldest men in his community, and he has been coming to this place since he was a boy small enough to be carried on his father's shoulders. The T-shaped stones have always been here. They were here before his grandfather, before his grandfather's grandfather. The people who carved them are a memory so old it has passed through story into something closer to weather, something ambient and unquestioned. But today he is not here to pray or to perform the ceremonies his people have practiced since before anyone can remember. Today he is here to bury them. The other men work in silence around him. They have been bringing baskets of fill for 3 days now: rubble, soil, flint fragments, the bones of animals left over from the feast that used to happen in this enclosure. The great carved pillars, some of them taller than 2 men standing on each other's shoulders, disappear slowly under the rising debris. He watches a fox carved in relief on the central stone vanish beneath a layer of packed earth, and he feels nothing he has a word for. The decision was made by the community. It was not made lightly. Something has ended, and whatever comes next cannot begin until this is covered over. 12,000 years ago, on the Anatolian plateau in what is now southeastern Turkey, a community of people deliberately buried one of the most complex ritual sites that had ever existed in the human world. They filled the enclosures themselves, they packed the soil, they walked away. The site they buried held carved limestone pillars weighing between 10 and 20 metric tons each, arranged in precise circular patterns, decorated with images of animals that functioned as a symbolic vocabulary we are only beginning to read. When archaeologists began excavating it in the 1990s, they found that the site had been intentionally, carefully, systematically covered over by the hands of the people who had built it. No one forced them, no invader swept through, no fire consumed the structures. The community chose to erase what it had made. That site is Göbekli Tepe, and it is the oldest known example of large-scale monumental architecture on Earth. It predates the pyramids of Giza by 7,000 years. It predates Stonehenge by 6,000 years. It predates what we were taught to call the beginning of civilization by somewhere between 4 and 6 millennia, depending on how you define the word, and it was deliberately buried. This is a documentary about cycles, about what gets built, what gets destroyed, and what gets forgotten so thoroughly that the forgetting itself becomes the evidence. Over the next 2 hours, you will hear about 6 distinct moments in the human past when something ended with enough violence or enough completeness that the people who came after had no reliable memory of what came before. 6 breaks in the record, 6 resets. And the civilization sitting at the end of that chain, the one reading this evidence, the one carbon dating the bones and drilling the ice cores and running the genetic sequences, is, by any reasonable count, the 7th attempt. There is no conspiracy in that claim. There is no secret suppressed by institutions. The evidence for each of these resets sits in peer-reviewed journals, in the layers of glacial ice extracted from Greenland and Antarctica, in the faunal remains of creatures that went extinct with bewildering speed, in the geological strata that show, with uncomfortable clarity, that the surface of this planet has been reorganized several times in the human evolutionary window. What is surprising is not that the evidence exists. What is surprising is how rarely it gets assembled into a single coherent picture. Tonight, that is what this documentary does. Before going any further, a moment to settle in. This channel makes long-form documentaries about the real history of Earth and its civilizations, built from the actual evidence left behind by the people who live through these events. The scripts are written to be listened to at night, at low volume, in a calm room. There is no need to follow every detail. The information moves at a steady pace. You can let it wash over you, and the parts that catch your attention will stay with you. If you have found this documentary while looking for something to listen to while you fall asleep, you are in exactly the right place. The word civilization is going to do a lot of work in this script, so it is worth being precise about what it means here. A civilization, for the purposes of this documentary, is a human social organization complex enough to produce surplus food, to allocate labor beyond immediate survival needs, to construct permanent or semi-permanent structures, and to develop some system of transmitting accumulated knowledge across generations. That last point matters most. The transmission of accumulated knowledge across generations is the defining feature that separates a civilization from a band of skilled and socially organized people, and it is precisely that transmission that a reset interrupts. When a reset happens, the chain breaks. The knowledge that took generations to accumulate either disappears with the people who held it, or survives in a form so degraded by trauma, migration, and demographic collapse that the next generation cannot use it. They start again, not from zero, because some things persist, some biological memory, some basic technique, some inherited instinct for social organization, but from a significantly lower baseline than the one that was destroyed. 6 times, the evidence suggests, this has happened within the human window. The first thing to understand about these 6 resets is that they are not evenly spaced in time, and they are not all the same kind of event. They range from the catastrophic, driven by impacts, volcanic super eruptions or rapid climate shifts, to the more gradual, driven by drought, demographic collapse, or the cascading failures of interconnected systems. What they share is the outcome: a civilization-level disruption severe enough to leave a mark in the geological and biological record, and to create a break in cultural continuity that the people on the other side of the break could not bridge. The second thing to understand is that the human species is old enough and has been behaviorally modern long enough for these 6 resets to fit comfortably within our timeline. Modern human cognition, the capacity for symbolic thought, language, planning, and complex social organization, has been documented in the fossil and archaeological record for at least 300,000 years. That is an enormous amount of time, long enough for multiple civilizations to rise, reach a threshold of complexity, and be erased so completely that the next attempt had to largely reinvent the wheel. 300,000 years. Our current civilization, dated generously from the first agricultural settlements in the Fertile Crescent, is approximately 12,000 years old. We have been behaviorally capable of building something like civilization for 25 times longer than our civilization has actually existed. The gap between those two numbers is what this documentary is about. The Younger Dryas is the name given to a period of rapid and severe climate reversal that began approximately 12,900 years ago and lasted for around 1,200 years. The name comes from a small Arctic wildflower, Dryas octopetala, whose pollen appears in European sediment cores from this period, indicating that temperatures in some parts of the northern hemisphere had dropped so sharply that Arctic vegetation was growing where temperate forests had previously stood. In Greenland ice cores, the temperature signal for the Younger Dryas onset is one of the most dramatic features in the entire record. Within decades, possibly within years, average annual temperatures in parts of the northern hemisphere dropped by somewhere between 10 and 15 degrees Celsius. That is not a gradual shift. That is a switch being thrown. The community that buried Göbekli Tepe lived on the other side of that switch. They were the inheritors of a world that had been warm, productive, and rich in large game for 10,000 years. The Pleistocene megafauna, the mammoths, the woolly rhinos, the giant deer, the cave lions, all of these were either already gone or in severe decline by the time the Younger Dryas ended. The landscape these people inhabited was reorganizing itself. The reliable rhythms of seasons and game migrations that their ancestors had built their lives around were no longer reliable, and they chose, at that moment, to bury the place where their accumulated ceremonial and probably astronomical knowledge had been stored in stone for centuries. The man filling those enclosures with rubble did not know he was participating in a reset. He only knew that something had ended and that the burial was the right thing to do. What he could not know was that the site he was covering over would lie hidden under the soil of Anatolia for approximately 11,000 years, until a Kurdish shepherd noticed an unusual concentration of carved stones in a field in 1963. The formal excavations that began in 1994, led by Klaus Schmidt of the German Archaeological Institute, revealed a site of such unexpected complexity that it required a fundamental reassessment of the standard timeline of human social development. The idea that large-scale organized construction required settled agriculture was the consensus before Göbekli Tepe. The site reversed the causality. The evidence here suggested that the organizational demands of building and maintaining a ritual center of this scale might themselves have been the pressure that drove communities toward agriculture, not the other way around. That reversal matters for this documentary because it means that the civilization buried under the soil of southeastern Turkey was not a simple foraging band that happened to stack some rocks. It was organised. It had specialists. It had a symbolic system sophisticated enough to carve animals in relief with enough consistency that the images carry meaning across enclosures and across what appears to be several centuries of construction. It had, in other words, the foundational architecture of something we would not hesitate to call civilization if we found it anywhere else in the record. And it was buried, and then it was forgotten. So completely forgotten that 12,000 years passed before anyone dug it up. That is what a reset looks like from the inside. The man on the plateau watches the last visible edge of the central stone disappear under the fill. The enclosure is now a slight mound in the ground, barely distinguishable from the surrounding terrain. By the time his grandchildren are old enough to ask about it, the story will already be dimming. By the time his great-grandchildren are alive, it will be a faint legend, something their ancestors built, something sacred, the details already fading into the simpler shape of myth. 11,000 years after that, a machine will lift the soil away and expose the fox again. The first reset is not a single event with a clean date and a single cause. It is a convergence, a period of roughly 2,000 years during which several catastrophic pressures arrived together, and the world that existed before them did not survive the combination. To understand what was lost, you have to understand what existed before the Younger Dryas, and to understand that, you have to go back further, to the period paleoclimatologists call the late Pleistocene, specifically to the window between 40,000 and 13,000 years ago, when anatomically and behaviourally modern humans were present on every habitable continent, and had been for long enough to have developed regional cultures of considerable sophistication. The cave paintings of Lascaux in southwestern France date to approximately 17,000 years ago. The paintings of Chauvet, in the same region, are older still, with some panels dated to 36,000 years ago. These are not scratches, they're compositions. The artists who made them understood perspective in a functional sense. They used the natural curves and protrusions of the cave walls to give their animals the illusion of three-dimensional form. They chose colours with intention, mixing red ochre, black manganese and yellow iron oxide to produce gradations of tone that suggest not just representation, but aesthetic judgment. The bison at Altamira, in what is now northern Spain, are depicted in motion. The horses at Chauvet have individually differentiated faces. The people who made these images were not primitive. They were the product of tens of thousands of years of accumulated cultural refinement, and the cultures they belonged to vanished, or were so radically transformed by the events of the Younger Dryas and its aftermath that the cave painting tradition effectively ended. After approximately 10,000 years ago, the great figurative painted caves of Europe go dark. No new Lascaux is created, no new Chauvet. The tradition that had produced some of the most sustained and technically accomplished visual art in human history simply stops. That is worth sitting with. A visual art tradition lasting at least 26,000 years, documented across hundreds of sites from Spain to the Ural Mountains, ends, and the civilization that produced it is absorbed into, or replaced by, something so different that the continuity is effectively broken. Across the Atlantic, the picture is similar. The Clovis people, named for the distinctive fluted projectile points first found near Clovis, New Mexico, were the dominant human culture of North America during the final millennia of the Pleistocene. They were highly effective hunters, capable of organising cooperative drives against megafauna. The archaeological signature of Clovis culture appears across an enormous geographic range, from the eastern seaboard to the Pacific coast, from the northern plains to Central America, in a span of time that most researchers place between 13,400 and 12,800 years ago. That range suggests not a single band, but a wide and successful cultural tradition, one that had adapted to the landscapes of an entire continent. Then Clovis ends, abruptly. The cultural signature disappears from the record at approximately the same time the Younger Dryas begins. Whether the Clovis people themselves disappeared, or whether they survived and transformed into the post-Clovis cultures that follow in the record, is a matter of ongoing debate. What is not debated is that the tradition ends with a speed that the normal rhythms of cultural evolution do not easily explain. At the same time, North America loses somewhere between 35 and 40 genera of large mammals: mammoths, mastodons, ground sloths the size of modern elephants, short-faced bears, American camels and horses, American lions, the Glyptodon, a relative of the armadillo that grew to the size of a Volkswagen Beetle. All of them gone, in geological terms, within the same narrow window. South America loses even more. Australia had already undergone its own megafaunal extinction event, beginning around 46,000 years ago and associated with the arrival of modern humans on that continent. But the pattern of rapid, large-scale biological loss is consistent across the global record. The cause, or causes, of this mass extinction have been debated since the 19th century. Two major hypotheses have dominated the literature. The first is overkill, the idea that modern human hunters, arriving in ecosystems where the megafauna had no prior experience of human predation, drove them to extinction through hunting pressure alone. The second is climate change, the idea that the rapid temperature shifts of the Younger Dryas and the ecological reorganization that followed destroyed the habitats these animals depended on faster than they could adapt. Both hypotheses have strong evidence behind them, and most researchers now accept that the answer is some combination of the two, with the proportions varying by region and taxon. A third hypothesis has gained significant traction since the early 2000s, and it sits at the more dramatic end of the spectrum. The Younger Dryas impact hypothesis proposes that the onset of the Younger Dryas was triggered by the impact or airburst of a fragmented comet or asteroid over the North American ice sheet, approximately 12,900 years ago. The hypothesis was first formally published in 2007 by a team of researchers, including Richard Firestone of the Lawrence Berkeley National Laboratory, and it has been both vigorously contested and vigorously supported in the years since. The evidence cited includes a thin layer of materials found in sediment cores from dozens of sites across North America, Europe, and the Middle East. A layer that contains elevated concentrations of nanodiamonds, magnetic spherules, iridium, and platinum, materials associated with extraterrestrial impacts. The layer consistently dates to the Younger Dryas boundary. The debate over the impact hypothesis is one of the more contentious in contemporary science, with papers published in major journals both supporting and challenging its central claims. What is not in dispute is that something happened at approximately 12,900 years ago that was severe enough to leave a chemical signature in the sedimentary record across multiple continents, to reverse a warming trend that had been underway for several thousand years, and to coincide with the rapid disappearance of both the megafauna and several major human cultural traditions. Whether the cause was an impact, a volcanic event, a disruption of the North Atlantic thermohaline circulation, or some combination of all three, the outcome for human civilization was the same. The complex, regionally differentiated cultures of the late Pleistocene, the cave painters of Europe, the Clovis hunters of North America, and the equally sophisticated but less archaeologically visible cultures of Africa, Asia, and South America all underwent disruptions severe enough to break their developmental trajectories. The world that came out the other side of the Younger Dryas, beginning around 11,700 years ago, was not a continuation of the world that had gone in. It was a restart. That restart is the moment Göbekli Tepe represents. The people who built those stone enclosures on the Anatolian plateau were among the first complex societies to emerge in the new post-Younger Dryas world. They were not starting from absolute zero. They carried biological and probably cultural inheritance from the Pleistocene populations that had survived the collapse. But they were building without the benefit of the accumulated institutional knowledge that had been developing in some regions for tens of thousands of years before them. The chain had been broken. In the Jordan Valley around 11,500 years ago, a community settled on a low hill above a reliable spring and began to build with a permanence their predecessors had not attempted. They dug storage pits first, then erected circular stone structures, then over the following centuries began to shape rectangular rooms with plaster floors smoothed to a finish, fine enough to reflect light. They grew emmer wheat and einkorn barley in the surrounding fields, kept goats, and buried their dead beneath the floors of their houses, sometimes removing the skull and placing it separately, sometimes covering it with plaster modelled into a human face. This was Jericho, and at its deepest excavated levels it is approximately 11,000 years old, making it one of the oldest continuously inhabited settlements on Earth. The plaster skulls found there are some of the most haunting artefacts of the early Neolithic, real human skulls with their features rebuilt in white lime plaster, the eyes sometimes inset with shells, the whole face repainted again and again over what appears to be decades of curation. These were not buried and forgotten. They were kept, they were maintained. They were in all probability the faces of ancestors, held present among the living as a form of connection to the lineage that preceded the current community. It is a remarkable impulse. The community at Jericho had survived into a new world, a world reorganized by the end of the Pleistocene and the climatic chaos of the Younger Dryas, and their response was to hold on to the faces of the people who had come before, to keep the continuity visible, to refuse the forgetting. The irony is that the forgetting happened anyway. The plaster skulls were eventually buried. The settlement was eventually abandoned and rebuilt and abandoned again. The people of early Jericho had no way of knowing that the tradition they were founding, settled agriculture, permanent architecture, stored surplus, ancestor veneration, would become the template for every civilization that followed. They were not founding anything in their own minds. They were simply trying to survive and to remember. The geological layer that separates the Pleistocene from the Holocene, the epoch we currently live in, is one of the clearest boundaries in the Quaternary record. Below that line, megafauna, glaciers covering a third of the planet's land surface, sea levels 60 to 120 meters lower than today, and human cultures of a kind we can barely reconstruct. Above that line, the world we inherited, smaller animals, exposed coastlines, forests where ice had been, and slowly the first experiments in the kind of organized social complexity we would eventually call civilization. The first reset left its mark in ice, in bone, in the sudden silence of painted caves, and in the deliberate burial of a ritual complex by the people who could no longer sustain it. The second reset requires a different kind of attention. It is quieter than the first. There is no impact layer in the sediment, no sudden temperature spike in the ice cores, no mass extinction event to anchor the date. What there is, instead, is an absence. A silence in the archaeological record that is all the more striking for how loud the record was immediately before it. By 8,000 years ago, the post-Younger Dryas world had been reorganizing itself for nearly 4,000 years, and the results were visible across a wide geographic range. In the Fertile Crescent, the arc of territory running from the Levantine coast through the upper Tigris and Euphrates valleys and down into the alluvial plains of what is now southern Iraq, settled agricultural communities had been developing for several millennia. The sites of this period show a consistent pattern of increasing complexity. Larger storage facilities, more sophisticated pottery, evidence of long-distance trade in obsidian and shells, and the early signs of social differentiation, meaning some burials are more elaborate than others, some houses are larger, some individuals appear to have had access to resources that others did not. This is the profile of a civilization beginning to stratify, and stratification is one of the reliable precursors of institutional complexity. In southeastern Europe, a culture known to archaeologists as the Vinča culture was developing along the Danube and its tributaries in what is now Serbia, Romania, Bulgaria, and Hungary. The Vinča people built two-story houses. They worked copper into tools and ornaments. They developed a system of incised symbols on pottery and figurines that some researchers have argued constitutes a proto-writing system, though this claim remains contested. They traded across hundreds of kilometers. Their settlements were not small. The site of Vinča itself, on the Danube south of modern Belgrade, covered an area of nearly 30 hectares at its peak, and may have housed several thousand people. The Vinča culture flourished for approximately 2,000 years, from around 5,500 to 3,500 BCE. And then it contracted sharply. The large settlements were abandoned. The population dispersed. The symbolic system, if it was a writing system, vanished from the record without producing a decipherable legacy. What happened to the Vinča people is connected to one of the most significant climate events of the Holocene, a period of rapid cooling and disruption known as the 5.9 kiloyear event, which occurred approximately 5,900 years ago. The evidence for this event comes from multiple sources: pollen records showing the sudden disappearance of forest species and the expansion of steppe vegetation across Central Europe and the Near East, lake sediment cores from the eastern Mediterranean showing a sharp increase in windblown dust indicative of aridification, and speleothem records, the growth layers of cave formations, showing a distinct shift in the oxygen isotope ratios associated with reduced rainfall. The 5.9 kiloyear event was not as catastrophic as the Younger Dryas in terms of temperature change. but it hit a world that was far more vulnerable to climate disruption than the one the Younger Dryas had struck. By 6,000 years ago, large portions of the human population in Europe and the Near East were no longer mobile foragers who could relocate when resources failed. They were settled farmers with fixed fields, granaries full of last year's harvest, and herds of domesticated animals that could not simply be left behind. When the rains failed and the rivers dropped and the pastures dried, they could not follow the food. They had to stay and watch it disappear. In the Sahara, the consequences were even more dramatic. This is perhaps the most visually striking evidence of the second reset, and it sits in plain sight for anyone who looks at a satellite image of North Africa. The Sahara is the largest hot desert on Earth, covering approximately 9 million square kilometres. It is an image of absolute aridity, of sand seas and stone plateaus and the occasional oasis. And yet the rock art panels found across this desert, in the Tassili Naja Plateau of Algeria, in the Fezzan region of Libya, in the Tibesti Mountains of Chad, depict a world that bears no resemblance to the landscape surrounding them. They show cattle, hippos, crocodiles, people swimming, people herding animals across grasslands, people in boats on rivers that no longer exist. These images were not made by people with unusual imaginations. They were made by people recording their actual environment. During a period climatologists call the African Humid Period, sometimes called the Green Sahara, which lasted from approximately 11,000 to 5,000 years ago, the Sahara was not a desert. Monsoon rains penetrated far into the continent, driven by orbital cycles that positioned the Earth differently relative to the Sun during summer months in the Northern Hemisphere. Lakes filled basins that are now dry pans. Rivers ran through valleys that are now buried under dunes. Grasslands and open woodland covered terrain that is now bare rock. The region supported populations of large mammals, and the human communities that lived there were pastoralists and hunter-gatherers of considerable sophistication, as evidenced not only by the rock art but by the tools, beads and burial sites found at sites now surrounded by empty desert. Around 5,500 to 5,000 years ago, the orbital forcing that had sustained the Green Sahara shifted, the monsoon retreated, and the desert returned. The transition was not gradual everywhere. Some models and sediment records suggest it happened with uncomfortable speed in some areas, with grassland giving way to desert within a matter of centuries rather than millennia. The people who had lived in the Green Sahara for thousands of years were pushed toward the surviving water sources: the Nile Valley, the Niger River, the northern coast, and the few permanent oases that persisted in the interior. A woman stands at the edge of what used to be a lake. She's perhaps 30 years old, which is considerably older than most of her community will live to be. The lake has been shrinking for as long as she can remember, its shoreline retreating year by year, the mud flats that used to be underwater cracking in the heat. The cattle are thinner than they were when her mother kept them. The grass that used to grow to her waist in the wet season barely reaches her knee now. She knows, without needing to articulate it in abstract terms, that this place is dying. Her community has already sent scouts east toward the great river valley her grandfather's stories described as a distant and somewhat mythical place. The scouts came back and said the valley was crowded with people who had already arrived before them, and that the land near the water was already claimed. She does not know that the people arriving in the Nile Valley from the failing Saharan grasslands are bringing with them the population pressure, the agricultural techniques, the animal husbandry knowledge, and the organisational complexity that will, within a few centuries, produce the earliest phases of what we now call ancient Egyptian civilization. She only knows the lake is smaller than it was, and that the grass is thin, and that her children are hungry. The influx of Saharan refugees into the Nile Valley is one of the better documented population movements of the ancient world, traceable through both the archaeological record and genetic studies of ancient Egyptian remains. The culture that emerged in the Nile Valley over the following centuries was a synthesis. It incorporated traditions from multiple displaced populations, from people who had developed complex social and symbolic systems in the Green Sahara over thousands of years, and compressed that accumulated sophistication into a narrower geographic band with a reliable annual flood as its organising ecological principle. The Nile flood was not just a water source, it was a calendar, a land redistribution mechanism, and a cosmic event that structured the entire symbolic and administrative life of the civilization that grew up around it. Each year the flood deposited a layer of rich silt across the valley floor, renewing the agricultural potential of the land without human effort. Each year, the recession of the waters revealed the field boundaries that the flood had obscured, requiring a systematic resurvey of land ownership and agricultural allocation. That resurvey demanded measurement, record-keeping, and administrative authority. The organisational pressure of managing the Nile flood may have been the single most powerful driver of the administrative complexity that eventually produced Egyptian writing, mathematics, and the bureaucratic state. But the people who built that state were not starting fresh. They were the inheritors of thousands of years of cultural development in the Saharan and Levantine populations that converged in the valley. The second reset compressed and redirected that development rather than erasing it entirely. Some continuity survived the climate collapse of the Green Sahara, carried in the bodies and memories of the people who walked east. What did not survive was the Saharan civilization itself, the painted cattle herders of Taslin Aja, the lakeshore communities of the Fezzan. The complex societies that had been developing in the African interior for millennia left no institutional legacy. Their accumulated knowledge of the land, its water systems, its seasonal rhythms, its animal populations, all of that was severed when the land itself died beneath them. Some fragments survived in oral tradition, in the symbolic vocabularies carried by migrants, in the genetic material of the people who reached the Nile. But the civilization as a functioning system ended. The desert erased it, and then the desert covered it. For 5,000 years, the rock art panels of the Tassili Plateau sat in an emptiness so complete that the people living on the edges of the Sahara had no reliable tradition connecting them to the world depicted in those images. When Henri Lotte led the first systematic survey of the Tassili paintings in the 1950s, the local Tuareg guides who helped his team navigate the plateau had no oral tradition that explained the swimming figures and the cattle herders and the round-headed beings that stare from the rock faces of the canyon walls. The connection had been broken too long ago, 5,000 years of silence. That is what a reset sounds like. The third reset is the one most people have heard of, even if they do not know it by that name. It is the one that generated the flood myths. Not one flood myth, not the Mesopotamian story alone, but dozens of them, distributed across cultures that had no contact with each other, all carrying the same structural memory. Water rose, the world was covered, almost everything was lost. A small group survived and began again. The question worth asking is not why so many cultures have a flood story. Flood stories are easy to generate. Rivers overflow, coastlines erode, local disasters happen. The question worth asking is why so many flood stories share specific structural features that go beyond the local. The warning given to a single family, the construction of a vessel, the survival of animals, the recession of the water, the sending of a bird to test whether land has reappeared. That specific sequence, with those specific elements, appears in the Sumerian epic of Ziusudra, in the Akkadian Atrahasis, in the Babylonian sections of the Gilgamesh epic, in the Hebrew account of Noah, in the Hindu story of Manu, in the Greek story of Deucalion, in accounts from indigenous cultures of Mesoamerica, the Pacific Islands, and the interior of North America. The specificity of the shared elements suggests a shared source, and the geological record offers one. At the end of the last ice age, the planet held an enormous amount of water locked in ice. As global temperatures rose following the Younger Dryas, that ice melted and sea levels rose. The overall process was not smooth. The meltwater did not enter the oceans at a constant rate. It came in pulses, driven by the periodic collapse of major ice sheets and the sudden drainage of the vast proglacial lakes that had accumulated behind glacial dams. These pulses of rapid sea level rise are documented in the sedimentary and geological record, and the largest of them was significant enough to have been catastrophic for human communities living on coastal lowlands. The most dramatic of these pulses, known as Meltwater Pulse 1A, occurred approximately 14,600 years ago and is estimated to have raised global sea levels by somewhere between 16 and 25 meters in a period as short as 500 years. That rate of rise, if sustained, would have been perceptible within a human lifetime. Communities living within a few meters of sea level would have watched the water advance year by year. But the pulse that most directly intersects with the flood myth tradition is a different event, one that was more localized but potentially more immediately catastrophic for the specific human populations it affected. Around 8,200 years ago, the massive preglacial lake known as Lake Agassiz, which had accumulated behind the Laurentide ice sheet in what is now central North America and covered an area larger than all of the modern Great Lakes combined, catastrophically drained into the North Atlantic. The volume of fresh water released was approximately 163,000 cubic kilometres, enough to raise global sea levels by roughly 1 to 4 metres in a very short time. More significantly, the sudden influx of cold fresh water into the North Atlantic disrupted the thermohaline circulation, the system of ocean currents that distributes heat around the planet, and triggered a rapid cooling event lasting approximately 150 to 400 years. This event, known as the 8.2 kiloyear event, is one of the most clearly documented abrupt climate events of the Holocene. Its consequences for human communities across the Northern Hemisphere were severe. In the Fertile Crescent, the 8.2 kiloyear event coincides with a period of significant settlement abandonment and population dispersal. Sites that had been continuously occupied for centuries were left. Agricultural systems that had been developing for millennia contracted. The evidence from pollen cores and lake sediments indicates a period of prolonged drought across the Middle East and Eastern Mediterranean that would have placed extraordinary stress on farming communities dependent on reliable rainfall. He's standing at the edge of his city, and the city is flooding. Not the slow creep of a rising river he has seen before in wet years, manageable, something the levees and the drainage channels are built to handle. This is different. The water is coming from everywhere at once. From the river, yes, but also from the ground itself, from the irrigation channels that have reversed direction, from the low places between the houses that are filling faster than anyone can explain. He has sent his sons to the upper storage rooms with the seed grain and the tablets, the clay tablets with the accounts of the last 3 harvests, the records of who owes what to whom, the lists of the field boundaries that were resurveyed after last year's flood. He sent the tablets because without the tablets the fields cannot be reallocated and the city cannot function next season. He does not know whether there will be a next season. The city he is standing in has no name we can recover. It is one of the early Ubaid period settlements of southern Mesopotamia, the alluvial plain between the Tigris and Euphrates that was being settled, drained, and farmed by some of the most organisationally sophisticated communities of the early 4th millennium BCE. The Ubaid culture, named for the site of Tel al-Ubaid near the ancient city of Ur, represents the cultural and demographic foundation on which Sumerian civilization was later built. Ubaid pottery has been found across an enormous geographic range, from the Persian Gulf to the headwaters of the Euphrates, suggesting a trading network and a shared cultural framework of considerable extent. The Ubaid settlements of the southern Mesopotamian alluvial plain were built in one of the most flood-vulnerable landscapes on Earth. The plain is extraordinarily flat. The rivers are meandering and unstable, shifting their courses over decades and centuries. The water table is close to the surface, a significant flood event, whether driven by the 8.2 kiloyear climate disruption or by one of the many other mechanisms that could produce catastrophic inundation in this landscape, would have been devastating. And the stratigraphic record at several Mesopotamian sites, most notably at Ur, Kish, Shuruppak, and Nineveh, contains evidence of distinct flood deposits, thick layers of water-laid silt separating cultural layers, layers with no artifacts, no occupation evidence, no organic material except the occasional fragment of reed, indicating that the settlements were covered by floodwaters and abandoned for a period before reoccupation. The flood layer at Ur, excavated by Leonard Woolley in the 1920s, is perhaps the most famous of these deposits. It is approximately 2.5 metres thick, composed of clean water-laid silt, and separates a lower Ubaid period occupation from an upper occupation that shows the beginnings of what would become Sumerian urban culture. Woolley famously interpreted this layer as evidence of the biblical flood, a claim that generated considerable excitement and considerable subsequent debate. The more cautious interpretation is that it represents a major regional flood event that was severe enough to disrupt occupation for an extended period, and that the cultural memory of this disruption, carried forward through the oral traditions of the populations who survived it, eventually crystallized into the flood narratives that appear in the Sumerian and Babylonian literary tradition. The Epic of Gilgamesh, the oldest surviving literary work of extended length in the human record, contains within it a story that is older than the epic itself. The flood narrative spoken by Utnapishtim to Gilgamesh is preserved in a version that appears on the 11th tablet of the Assyrian library recension of the epic, copied in the 7th century BCE, but the story it contains is considerably older. A Sumerian version of the flood myth, with a figure called Ziusudra rather than Utnapishtim, has been dated to approximately 1700 BCE, and the narrative elements it contains suggest an oral tradition extending much further back. The god Enki warns Ziusudra of the decision of the assembly of gods to send a flood to destroy humanity. Ziusudra builds a great boat. The flood lasts 7 days and 7 nights. When it ends, Ziusudra opens a window and the sunlight falls on his face, and he prostrates himself before the sun god Utu. The detail of the window is telling. It is the kind of detail that survives in oral tradition, because it is concrete and visual and emotionally resonant. The moment when the man in the dark boat opens a gap in the hull and sees light for the first time in 7 days. That detail does not feel invented. It feels remembered. Across the Persian Gulf from the Mesopotamian alluvial plain, the sea itself holds another piece of the third RESETS evidence. During the height of the last ice age, when sea levels were significantly lower than today, the Persian Gulf was not a gulf at all. It was a river valley, a low-lying basin through which a large river fed by the combined drainage of the Tigris, Euphrates, Kharan and Wadi Batin flowed southeastward into the Indian Ocean. The floor of this valley is now underwater, but sonar mapping and sediment coring have revealed the presence of river channels, lake beds, and what appear to be the remnants of human habitation. Stone structures, hearths, and tool assemblages on the now submerged shelf. As sea levels rose following the Ice Age, the Persian Gulf filled. The process took millennia, but the final phases of inundation, as the rising Indian Ocean breached the threshold at the Strait of Hormuz and began to fill the valley from the east, may have been relatively rapid. The communities living in that valley would have had to relocate, moving north and northwest into the Mesopotamian plain and the surrounding highlands. They would have carried their accumulated knowledge, their social structures, their symbolic systems, and their memories of the world they had lost. Some researchers, including the geographer Farouk El-Baz and the archaeologist Geoffrey Rose, have argued that the submerged Persian Gulf basin represents a lost homeland of considerable cultural significance, a place where the foundations of what became Sumerian civilization may have been developing for thousands of years before the flood that covered it. The hypothesis remains at the speculative end of the scholarly spectrum, but the evidence for significant human habitation on the now submerged Gulf shelf during the late Pleistocene and early Holocene is solid. People lived there, then the water came, and they left. The third reset was written in water, and then the water covered the evidence. What remained was the memory, compressed and reshaped by time into the structured narratives of divine punishment and miraculous survival that appear in the world's oldest literature. The Sumerian scribes who wrote down the story of Ziusudra were not inventing theology. They were preserving, in the only form available to them, the institutional memory of a catastrophe so complete that no other record of it survived. The fourth reset is the most archaeologically documented of the 6, and in some ways the most unsettling, because it happened to civilizations that were not primitive, not marginal, and not isolated. It happened to some of the most sophisticated urban cultures the ancient world had produced, and it happened to all of them at approximately the same time. The period around 3200 to 1200 BCE represents one of the most remarkable chapters in human history. Across a broad geographic zone stretching from the Aegean Sea in the west to the Indus Valley in the east, and from Anatolia in the north to Egypt in the south, multiple complex civilizations were flourishing simultaneously. They were not isolated from each other. They traded. They sent ambassadors. They wrote letters in cuneiform on clay tablets that have survived in the diplomatic archives of several of these states. They were aware of each other's existence, of each other's power, and of the web of relationships that connected them. In the Aegean, the Mycenaean civilization had built a network of palace-centered states on the Greek mainland and the surrounding islands. The palaces at Mycenae, Tiryns, Pylos and Thebes were not simply large houses. They were administrative centres of considerable complexity, housing scribes who kept records in a syllabic writing system, Linear B, that was used to track the allocation of agricultural surplus, the distribution of rations to palace workers, the inventory of weapons and textiles and livestock. The Mycenaean palaces controlled significant hinterlands, organised craft production, and maintained maritime trade connections across the eastern Mediterranean. On the island of Crete, the Minoan civilization, older than the Mycenaean and the cultural ancestor of many Mycenaean practices, had already experienced its own severe disruption around 1500 BCE, associated with the eruption of the Thera volcano, one of the largest volcanic events of the Holocene. The Minoan palace at Knossos survived that eruption, but in a diminished form, and the culture that persisted on Crete after 1500 BCE shows clear evidence of Mycenaean influence, and possibly Mycenaean administrative control. The Minoans, as an independent civilizational force, were already fading before the Great Collapse. To the east, the Hittite Empire had consolidated control over most of Anatolia and northern Syria, building a state sophisticated enough to negotiate the world's first surviving peace treaty, the Treaty of Kadesh, with Egypt in roughly 1259 BCE. The Hittite capital of Hattusa, in the bend of the Kızılırmak River in central Anatolia, was a city of considerable scale. Its walls enclosed an area of approximately 180 hectares, and its population at its peak may have reached 40 to 50,000 people. The Hittites had mastered iron smelting techniques that gave them a military and technological advantage over their neighbours, and they maintained a sophisticated diplomatic correspondence with Egypt, Babylon, Assyria, and the Mycenaean states. In the Levant, the city of Ugarit on the Syrian coast was one of the great commercial hubs of the late Bronze Age world. Its archive of clay tablets, discovered in the 1920s and still being analysed, contains correspondence in 7 different languages and at least 4 different writing systems, a snapshot of the cosmopolitan complexity of international trade in the 13th century BCE. Merchants from Ugarit traded with Egypt, Cyprus, the Aegean, and Mesopotamia. The city's warehouses held goods from across the known world, and Egypt, of course, was at the height of its new kingdom power, with pharaohs building temples at Karnak and Abu Simbel, administering an empire that extended into Nubia to the south and the Levant to the northeast, and maintaining diplomatic correspondence with every major power of the age. Then, within a window of roughly 50 years centered on approximately 1200 BCE, almost all of it collapsed. She's a scribe in the palace at Pylos, in the southwestern Peloponnese, and it is the last year of the palace's existence, though she does not know that yet. She sits in the archive room in the early morning, the smell of fresh clay around her, a lamp of olive oil burning at her elbow. Her task for the day is to complete the inventory of the rowers allocated to the coastal watch. The palace administration has been mobilising men for the defence of the coastline for several months now, and the records of who has been assigned where have become increasingly urgent and increasingly chaotic. She presses the reed stylus into the soft clay with practised efficiency. She has been doing this since she was 12 years old. The tablets she's producing today will never be read by the officials they are meant for. Within months, the palace at Pylos will burn. The fire will be hot enough to bake the clay tablets that are scattered across the archive floor, preserving them accidentally, turning what were meant to be temporary administrative records into the best evidence we have of the last days of Mycenaean administrative culture. Among the tablets baked in that fire are records of the coastal watch, of the deployment of rowers and soldiers, of offerings made to the gods, and of the redistribution of bronze from palace stores, the last of which suggests that the administration was melting down bronze objects to make weapons, a measure of last resort. The palace burned, the scribe's tablets survived. She did not. Across the eastern Mediterranean, the pattern repeats. Hattusa was burned and abandoned around 1200 BCE. The archaeological evidence at the site shows no subsequent reoccupation of the palace quarter. The people who burned Hattusa did not move in afterward. Ugarit was destroyed around the same time, and in its archive archaeologists found a letter that had been placed in a kiln to be fired for delivery but was never sent. The letter was from the king of Ugarit to the king of Alashia, the ancient name for Cyprus, and it describes enemy ships offshore and an attack already underway. The king of Ugarit writes that he has no troops left, his infantry and chariotry having already been sent to other theatres of war. He's asking for help. The letter was never fired. The city fell before the kiln was lit. That unfinished letter, sitting in the kiln at Ugarit for 3,200 years, is one of the most direct pieces of evidence for the speed of the Bronze Age collapse. This was not a gradual decline. It was fast enough that a royal correspondence requesting military aid could be interrupted before it was completed. The Bronze Age collapse of approximately 1200 BCE is one of the most intensively studied events in ancient history, and its causes remain genuinely debated. Several factors have been proposed, and most researchers now accept that the collapse was multi-causal, meaning that no single cause is sufficient to explain a disruption of such geographic breadth and such completeness. The proposed causes include invasions by the groups the Egyptian records call the Sea Peoples, groups of migrants and raiders whose origins are still debated, but who appear in Egyptian reliefs attacking coastlines across the eastern Mediterranean. Climate change and drought are another factor, with paleoclimatic evidence from pollen cores and isotope records suggesting a prolonged drought across the eastern Mediterranean beginning around 1250 BCE. Internal rebellions and social stress from within the palace economies have been proposed. Disruption of the tin trade, which was essential for bronze production and which depended on long-distance supply chains from Afghanistan and possibly Britain, has been suggested as a systemic economic failure that undermined the interconnected palatial economies simultaneously. The historian Eric Klein, whose 2014 synthesis of the Bronze Age collapse evidence is one of the most thorough treatments of the subject, argues for what he calls a perfect storm, a combination of drought, invasion, internal rebellion, disrupted trade, and possibly earthquake that overwhelmed the resilience of interconnected systems that had no redundancy, no capacity to absorb multiple simultaneous shocks. What makes the Bronze Age collapse a reset, rather than simply a period of political instability, is what happened after it. The 2 centuries following approximately 1200 BCE, roughly 1200 to 1000 BCE, are what archaeologists call the Greek Dark Ages, though the darkness was not confined to Greece. Across the former territory of the Mycenaean civilization, the population declined sharply. The palace economies vanished. Linear B, the writing system used by Mycenaean scribes, disappeared entirely, not reformed, not replaced by a successor system, but simply gone. For approximately 400 years, the Aegean world was effectively illiterate. The accumulated administrative and literary knowledge encoded in that writing system was lost. When writing reappeared in the Greek world, around 800 BCE, it was a completely different system. The alphabetic script borrowed and adapted from the Phoenicians. The new Greek literacy had no institutional continuity with Mycenaean Linear B. The people who learned to read and write in 800 BCE Greece were not recovering a lost tradition. They were beginning a new one from a different source, on a different substrate. In Anatolia, the Hittite state collapsed so completely that its very existence was forgotten. The Hittites are mentioned in the Hebrew Bible and in Egyptian records, but by the classical period, Greek and Roman writers had no knowledge of a Hittite empire. The massive ruins of Hattusa sat in the Anatolian highlands without any surviving cultural tradition connecting them to the civilization that had built them. When European travellers first began to document the ruins of Hattusa in the 19th century, they did not know what they were looking at. The identification of the Hittite civilization and the decipherment of the cuneiform tablets that eventually confirmed the identification was one of the major archaeological achievements of the early 20th century. 3,000 years of forgetting, complete enough that an entire empire had to be rediscovered from scratch. The fourth reset did not erase writing everywhere. Egypt survived, diminished but continuous. Mesopotamia survived, its cuneiform tradition intact, its cities reduced but not abandoned. The Phoenician cities of the Levantine coast survived and went on to develop the alphabet that would eventually become the writing system of Greece, Rome, and the modern Western world. But the specifically Aegean and Anatolian branch of Bronze Age civilization, with its palace economies, its Linear B administration, its sophisticated redistributive systems, and its web of international diplomatic relationships, ended. Completely and permanently. 4 centuries of illiteracy followed in the Aegean. 4 centuries during which the knowledge encoded in Linear B, the records of field allocations, ration distributions, craft inventories, and whatever literary or religious texts may have been kept in forms that did not survive the palace fires, was simply gone. The Greeks of the classical period, the civilization that produced Socrates and Thucydides and the Parthenon, had no direct institutional memory of the Mycenaean civilization that had preceded them. They had myths, fragments, the vague memory of heroes and a great war at Troy. But the administrative and organizational knowledge, the accumulated practical wisdom of how to run a complex palace economy, had to be rebuilt from the beginning. That rebuilding took 4 centuries, and what emerged from it was something genuinely new. The 5th reset is different from the others in that it happened regionally rather than globally, and in that the evidence for it is written almost entirely in ash, in the sudden silence of cities that had been occupied for over 1,000 years, and in the mass graves of people who died so quickly that their bodies were left where they fell. By the middle of the 1st millennium BCE, the world had reorganized itself again. The collapse of the late Bronze Age palace economies was centuries in the past. New civilizations had risen in their place, and some of them had grown to extraordinary levels of complexity and population. In Mesoamerica, far from the Mediterranean disruptions of the previous reset, a distinct and wholly independent trajectory of civilizational development had been underway for at least 2,000 years. The Maya civilization is not a single polity. It is a cultural and linguistic network spread across an enormous geographic area encompassing the Yucatan Peninsula, the highlands of Guatemala, portions of Belize, Honduras, and El Salvador, and the lowlands of the Petén region. The cities within this network shared a writing system, a calendrical tradition, a set of architectural conventions, and a cosmology that structured their ritual life and their political legitimacy. But they were not politically unified. They were independent city-states, each with its own dynasty, its own patron gods, its own cycle of alliance and conflict with neighbouring polities. At its height during the period archaeologists call the Classic Maya period, roughly 250 to 900 CE, the Maya lowlands were one of the most densely populated regions of the pre-Columbian Americas. The great cities of Tikal, Calakmul, Copan, Palenque, and dozens of others were not small. Tikal's population at its peak may have reached 100,000 people or more, sustained by an intensive agricultural system based on maize cultivation, supplemented by cacao, beans, squash, and managed forest gardens. The Maya developed a writing system sophisticated enough to encode the full complexity of their spoken language, and they used it to record royal genealogies, mythological narratives, astronomical observations, and historical events with a precision that allows modern scholars to reconstruct individual reigns with surprising accuracy. The Maya mapped the night sky with extraordinary care. Their astronomical tables, preserved in the few surviving codices and in the inscriptions on stelae and buildings, track the cycles of Venus, the moon, the solar year, and the longer cyclical patterns that structured their cosmology. They knew that the solar year was approximately 365.25 days long. They knew the synodic period of Venus with an accuracy that matches modern calculations to within a few hours over centuries. They built observatories, architectural alignments that marked solstices and equinoxes, and ritual centres organised around calendrical cycles that integrated agricultural, astronomical, and ceremonial time into a single system. And then, beginning in the late 8th century and accelerating through the 9th century CE, the cities of the southern Maya lowlands began to collapse. One by one, the great centres stopped erecting dated monuments. Stelae that had been raised every 5 or 10 years to mark the Katun cycles, the 20-year periods of the Maya long count calendar, simply stopped appearing. Royal inscriptions ceased. Building projects were abandoned mid-construction, and the populations that had sustained these cities for centuries either died or dispersed into the surrounding countryside. He's a stonemason in Tikal, and he is carving what will turn out to be the last dated monument the city ever erects. The date on the stela is 10.3. In the long count, which corresponds to roughly 879 CE in the Gregorian calendar. The stela commemorates a Katun ending, a ritual cycle that has been marked in this city for longer than anyone can remember. The king whose image he is carving into the stone died 3 years ago. His successor has not yet commissioned another monument. The mason does not know that no successor ever will. He only knows that the work has slowed, that the royal court has fewer attendants than it used to, that the ritual feasts that used to accompany the Katun ceremonies are smaller and quieter. He has heard from traders coming north from Copan that the southern cities are in trouble, that the population is leaving, that the fields are going fallow. Tikal is farther north, more stable, but even here the signs of stress are visible. The dry seasons are lasting longer. The reservoirs that feed the city's water supply are lower than they should be at this time of year. The maize harvest last year was adequate but not abundant. He finishes carving the glyph for the king's name, sets down his tools, and walks back across the plaza toward his house in the residential quarter. The stela will be raised in 3 days. It will stand in the plaza for over 1,000 years. No one will carve another after it. The collapse of the classic Maya civilization in the southern lowlands is one of the best documented examples of a complex society undergoing a catastrophic system failure, and it has been studied intensively by archaeologists, climatologists, and environmental scientists for decades. The evidence base is rich: stratified archaeological deposits showing the sequence of abandonment, skeletal remains showing evidence of malnutrition and disease, paleoclimatic data from lake sediments and speleothems showing the precipitation history of the region, pollen cores showing the ecological changes in the landscape, and the inscriptions themselves, which provide a precise chronological framework for the collapse. The timeline is clear. The last dated monument at Copan is 822 CE, at Quirigua 810 CE, at Palenque 799 CE, at Tikal 869 CE, at Calakmul the last monument is 909 CE. Within a window of roughly 150 years, the tradition of erecting dated stelae, a practice that had been continuous across the Maya lowlands for 600 years, ended, and with it ended the royal dynasties, the centralized ritual economies, and the urban populations those dynasties had organized. The cause, or more accurately the cluster of causes, has been debated extensively, and the current scholarly consensus points to a combination of drought, overpopulation, environmental degradation, and warfare. Sediment cores from Lake Chichancanab in the Yucatan, analysed for oxygen isotope ratios that serve as a proxy for rainfall, show a series of severe droughts in the Maya lowlands during the 9th century, with the worst episodes occurring around 810, 860, and 910 CE. These dates align closely with the abandonment of major cities. The drought hypothesis is strong, but drought alone does not explain why the Maya collapse was so complete, and why recovery did not occur when the rains returned. The additional factors matter. The southern Maya lowlands were, by the 8th century, severely overpopulated relative to their carrying capacity. The agricultural systems that sustained the cities were based on intensive maize cultivation, which required constant clearing of forest, constant input of labour, and constant management of thin tropical soils that degrade quickly under continuous farming. Pollen evidence from the Classic period shows deforestation on a massive scale, with forest cover in some regions reduced to less than 30% of the landscape. Soil erosion increased, agricultural productivity declined. The system was fragile. When the droughts hit, the fragile system broke. The cities could not feed their populations. Malnutrition and disease increased. Skeletal evidence from burial sites in the terminal Classic period shows elevated levels of porotic hyperostosis and cribra orbitalia, conditions associated with chronic anemia and nutritional deficiency. Political stability depended on the ability of kings to perform the rituals that were believed to sustain the cosmic order and ensure agricultural fertility. When the rains did not come and the harvests failed, the ritual legitimacy of the kings was called into question. Some inscriptions from the late Classic period show increased references to warfare and to the capture and sacrifice of rival rulers, suggesting that the period was one of escalating political violence as well as environmental stress. The collapse, when it came, was not uniform. Some cities persisted longer than others. Some populations migrated north to the cities of the northern Yucatan, which were less densely populated and had access to different water sources. The cenotes, natural sinkholes that provided reliable groundwater even during droughts. The northern cities of Chichen Itza and Uxmal flourished for several more centuries, absorbing refugees from the south and developing their own distinct political and architectural traditions. But the southern lowland heartland of the classic Maya civilization was abandoned. The cities were left to the jungle. The plazas where kings had been crowned and captives sacrificed grew over with vegetation. The palaces collapsed. The writing tradition ended. For the people who remained in the lowlands, in dispersed agricultural settlements and small towns, the institutional memory of the great cities faded quickly. By the time the Spanish arrived in the 16th century, the ruins of Tikal and Copan were already ancient mysteries to the Maya populations living nearby. The local people had oral traditions that spoke of the ruins as the works of giants or of gods, but they had no clear memory of the dynasties that had ruled there, no continuity with the writing system, no understanding of the stelae that recorded the names and deeds of kings. The knowledge encoded in that writing system, the astronomical tables, the mythological narratives, the historical records, survived only in the 4 codices that escaped destruction by Spanish priests, and in the inscriptions on the monuments themselves, which were not deciphered until the 20th century. For 400 years, from the collapse in the 9th century to the Spanish conquest in the 16th, the written tradition of the classic Maya was essentially dead. The people survived, the language survived, but the institutional knowledge, the accumulated organizational and cosmological sophistication of a civilization that had flourished for 600 years was broken. The 5th reset was written in the silence of cities overgrown by rainforest, in the blank faces of stelae that were never carved, in the reservoirs that ran dry, and in the mass graves of people who starved in the plazas they had built. The 6th reset is the most recent, the most globally distributed, and the one that came closest to erasing everything. It happened within the span of human memory, if you count memory broadly enough, within the oral traditions of indigenous cultures on multiple continents, and it is documented in a geological and climatological record so clear that the debate is not whether it happened, but only how many people survived it. Between roughly 75,000 and 70,000 years ago, a supervolcano erupted in what is now northern Sumatra. The mountain is called Toba, and the eruption was one of the largest volcanic events of the last 2 million years. The volume of material ejected is estimated at approximately 2,800 cubic kilometres, roughly 2 orders of magnitude larger than the eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815, which caused the year without a summer and global crop failures across the northern hemisphere. The Toba eruption left a caldera, a collapsed volcanic crater that is 100 kilometres long and 30 kilometres wide. The caldera is now filled with water and forms Lake Toba, the largest volcanic lake on Earth. The ash from the Toba eruption has been found in sediment cores and ice cores across a vast geographic range. Ash layers from Toba appear in marine sediment cores from the South China Sea, the Arabian Sea, and the Indian Ocean. They appear in lake sediment cores from India. They appear in ice cores from Greenland. The distribution of the ash indicates that the eruption column reached the stratosphere and that the fine particulate matter circulated globally, blocking sunlight and lowering temperatures across the planet for a period that estimates suggest may have lasted between 6 and 10 years, with residual cooling effects persisting for decades or longer. The climatic impact of the Toba eruption is referred to in the volcanological and paleoclimatic literature as a volcanic winter, a period of sustained below normal temperatures driven by the presence of sulfate aerosols and ash particles in the stratosphere. These particles reflect incoming solar radiation back into space, reducing the amount of energy that reaches the Earth's surface. Temperature reconstructions based on ice core isotope data suggest that average global temperatures may have dropped by between 3 and 5 degrees Celsius in the immediate aftermath of the eruption, with much larger drops in some regions, particularly downwind of the eruption site in South and Southeast Asia. A woman crouches in the entrance of a rock shelter on the southern coast of what is now South Africa. She's perhaps 25 years old, thin, her hair braided back from her face with a strip of softened hide. The fire behind her is small, built from driftwood and dry grass, and she tends it carefully. Outside the shelter, the sky has been grey for longer than she can clearly remember. Not the grey of an overcast day which passes, but a permanent dimness that makes the sun a pale disk, barely visible through the haze. The air smells strange, acidic, and it makes her throat hurt when she breathes too deeply. Her community has been living in this rock shelter for 3 generations, moving between the coast and the inland valleys with the seasons, following the game and the plant harvests. But the seasons are wrong now. It is the time of year when the herds should be moving north along the coast, when the bushes should be heavy with berries, when the rivers should be running clear and full from the rains. The herds have not come. The berries did not ripen. The rivers are low and the fish are scarce. Her daughter, 2 years old, is sick with a cough that will not clear, and there is no honey left to ease it. She does not know that a mountain on the other side of the world has exploded with enough force to darken the sky across the entire planet. She only knows that the world has changed, that the cold has settled in and will not leave, and that her people are fewer this year than they were last year. The Toba catastrophe theory, first proposed in its modern form by the anthropologist Stanley Ambrose in 1998, argues that the Toba eruption triggered a population bottleneck in the human species severe enough to reduce the global human population to as few as 3,000 to 10,000 individuals. The evidence Ambrose cited includes genetic data showing that modern human genetic diversity is unusually low compared to other large mammal species, suggesting that the human population underwent a severe constriction at some point in the relatively recent evolutionary past. The timing of that constriction, estimated from mitochondrial DNA and Y chromosome mutation rates, aligns roughly with the date of the Toba eruption. The theory has been both supported and challenged in the 2 decades since its publication. The genetic evidence for a bottleneck is solid, but the timing and severity remain debated. Some genetic studies suggest the bottleneck may have been less severe than Ambrose initially proposed, with effective population sizes closer to 10,000 to 30,000, rather than 3,000. Other studies suggest that the bottleneck may not have been synchronous across all human populations, meaning some regional groups were more severely affected than others. The archaeological record from the period immediately following Toba is thin, which itself may be evidence of population decline, but the thinness of the record also makes it difficult to distinguish between a genuine population collapse and the normal gaps in preservation and discovery that characterize any archaeological dataset from this time depth. What is not debated is that Toba erupted, that the eruption was catastrophic, and that the eruption coincided with a period of severe environmental stress that shows up in multiple independent lines of evidence. Pollen records from lake cores in India show a sudden shift from tropical forest vegetation to grassland immediately following the Toba ash layer, indicating a dramatic change in regional climate. Marine sediment cores from the Arabian Sea show a reduction in biological productivity, meaning fewer organisms living in the surface waters, which is consistent with a period of reduced sunlight and lower ocean temperatures. Ice cores from Greenland show a cold spike in the oxygen isotope record at roughly the same time. The 6th reset was not purely the result of the Toba eruption. The eruption occurred during a period that was already experiencing glacial conditions, the early phase of the last ice age. The world was already cold, the eruption made it colder, and the combination of an already stressed climate system and a sudden additional shock was enough to push human populations, which were still small and thinly distributed across the old world, to the edge of extinction. How close to extinction is a matter of interpretation. The genetic bottleneck suggests that the global human population was reduced to a level where any additional shock, a regional drought, an epidemic, a second volcanic event could have finished the process. The fact that we are here, that the species survived, is not inevitable in retrospect. It was contingent. It depended on the survival of a relatively small number of breeding populations, probably located in climatically favourable refugia, regions where local conditions were stable enough to sustain human life even when the broader planetary system was in crisis. The southern coast of Africa is one of the most frequently cited candidates for such a refugium. The archaeological sites of Pinnacle Point, Blombos Cave, and Clayse's River mouth, all located on the southern Cape Coast of South Africa, contain evidence of continuous or near-continuous human occupation through the period around 70,000 years ago. The people living there were anatomically and behaviourally modern. They used ochre for symbolic purposes, they made shell beads, they produced sophisticated stone tools using pressure flaking techniques, and they exploited a wide range of coastal resources including shellfish, seabirds, and marine mammals. The coastal environment, with its reliable tidal cycles and its abundance of protein-rich intertidal resources, may have provided a buffer against the climatic chaos affecting the continental interior. Other potential refugia include the Rift Valley lakes of East Africa, the tropical forests of Central Africa, and possibly certain river valleys in South Asia. The evidence is fragmentary, but the pattern that emerges is consistent. The human populations that survived the Toba event and the subsequent millennia of harsh glacial conditions were those living in places where local geography and ecology provided stable resources even when the broader climate was unstable. But survival in a refugium is not the same as cultural continuity. The populations that emerged from the refugia after the climate stabilised, beginning around 60,000 years ago, were genetically continuous with the populations that had entered the refugia, but the cultural and institutional knowledge they carried was likely severely degraded. Small populations, isolated for long periods, cannot maintain the same diversity of skills, symbolic traditions, and technological knowledge as larger, interconnected populations. Some knowledge was surely lost, some technologies simplified, some symbolic systems reduced to their core elements. The archaeological record from the period immediately after the Toba event is too sparse to allow detailed reconstruction of what was lost, but the pattern that follows is suggestive. Beginning around 60,000 to 50,000 years ago, the evidence for behavioural modernity, the full suite of symbolic and technological practices that characterise modern human culture, begins to appear with increasing frequency and geographic breadth. This is the period when modern humans begin to expand out of Africa in significant numbers, when they reach Australia, when they begin to move into Europe and Asia, when the archaeological record fills with art, complex tools, personal ornaments, and burial practices that indicate fully developed symbolic thought. That flowering, that sudden efflorescence of human culture across the old world is not the beginning of behavioural modernity. It is the recovery from a bottleneck. The people who painted the caves of Chauvet and carved the Lion Man of Hohenstein-Stadel 35,000 years ago were not inventing symbolic culture. They were expressing a capacity that had existed in their ancestors for tens of thousands of years before them. But the continuity of that expression had been interrupted. The chain had been broken, and what came after the break was not a simple continuation, but a rebuilding. The woman at the coast watches her daughter sleep. The child's breathing shallow and wet. Outside, the dim sun is setting behind the haze, and the cold is coming on again. She does not know that her lineage will survive, that her mitochondrial DNA will be carried forward through thousands of generations, that the beads she strings from shells will be found 75,000 years later in a layer of sediment below the floor of this same rock shelter. She only knows that the fire is low and that the wood is scarce, and that tomorrow she will have to go out again to search for food. But she is here, and her people are here, and that is enough. The pattern that emerges from these 6 resets is not cyclical in the sense of a predictable rhythm. The intervals are irregular, the mechanisms vary. But the outcome is consistent. Civilizations rise to a threshold of complexity, accumulate knowledge across generations, build institutions that appear stable, and then something breaks. The break is usually fast, faster than the institutions can adapt, and the knowledge that took centuries to accumulate disappears within a span of years or decades. What follows is not immediate recovery, but a long period of reduced complexity, during which the survivors rebuild from a lower baseline, often without access to the organizational or technological knowledge their predecessors had developed. Our current civilization, the 7th by this count, is the product of approximately 12,000 years of continuous development since the end of the Younger Dryas. That continuity is real, but it is also fragile. The writing systems we use, the agricultural techniques that feed our populations, the scientific knowledge we accumulate, all of it depends on the survival of the institutions that preserve and transmit that knowledge across generations. If those institutions fail, the knowledge does not automatically persist. It has to be actively maintained, and maintenance requires stability. The question worth asking is not whether a 7th reset is possible. The geological and historical record makes it clear that resets have happened before, and that the mechanisms capable of producing them, climate disruption, volcanic events, population pressure, systemic ecological collapse, warfare, are all still present in the modern world. The question is whether our current civilization has developed sufficient resilience, sufficient redundancy in its systems, to survive a shock of the kind that destroyed its predecessors. The answer is not straightforward. In some ways, modern civilization is more resilient than any previous human society. We have global communication networks, distributed food storage, advanced medical systems, and scientific knowledge encoded in multiple formats and locations. A volcanic winter of the kind produced by Toba would still be catastrophic, but it would not reduce the global population to 10,000 people scattered in isolated refugia. We have the technological capacity to sustain populations through extended periods of reduced agricultural productivity. We have seed banks. We have knowledge of indoor farming, hydroponics, and food synthesis. We have the infrastructure to distribute resources across continents. But in other ways, modern civilization is more fragile than the dispersed, small-scale societies that survived previous resets. Our food systems depend on supply chains that span the globe and that are optimized for efficiency rather than resilience. A disruption to those supply chains, whether from climate breakdown, fuel shortages, political instability, or pandemic, can produce localized famine within weeks. Our technological infrastructure depends on rare earth elements extracted from a small number of locations, on manufacturing concentrated in specific regions, and on expertise held by a relatively small number of specialists. The knowledge required to maintain a modern electrical grid, to produce semiconductor chips, to refine antibiotics, is not widely distributed. It is held by institutions and individuals, and if those institutions collapse, or those individuals die without successors, the knowledge is at risk. The resets documented in this script were not caused by a lack of intelligence or resourcefulness in the people who experienced them. The Maya were sophisticated astronomers and mathematicians. The Mycenaeans were literate administrators who managed complex economies. The Pleistocene humans who survived the Younger Dryas were behaviourally modern, capable of abstract thought and long-term planning. They all failed not because they were stupid, but because they were vulnerable to systemic shocks they could not predict and could not absorb. A man sits in a library in Alexandria in the 4th century CE. The library is not the Great Library of Alexandria, the one founded by the Ptolemies, which burned or was gradually dispersed centuries earlier. This is a smaller institution, a collection of scrolls and codices maintained by a philosophical school. He is copying a text, a commentary on Aristotle, from a scroll that is already 300 years old and deteriorating. He copies carefully, his hand trained since boyhood in the formal script required for philosophical texts. He does not know that within a century the city will be in decline, that the schools will close, that the texts he is copying will be scattered, some lost forever, others surviving only in fragments or in later Arabic translations made from Persian translations, made from Syriac translations of the Greek originals he is holding in his hands right now. He is performing an act of preservation, but preservation is not automatic. It requires continuous effort, and when the effort stops, the preservation fails. The 7th civilization, the one currently occupying the planet, has an advantage the previous 6 did not have. It knows the previous 6 existed. The archaeological and geological sciences have recovered enough of the record to make the pattern visible. We can see the resets, we can study the mechanisms, we can identify the vulnerabilities. That knowledge does not guarantee survival, but it provides the possibility of intentional resilience, of building systems designed not for maximum efficiency, but for robustness in the face of shocks. The resets also clarify what is at stake. The loss is not simply the loss of buildings or political structures, it is the loss of accumulated knowledge, the kinds of knowledge that take generations to develop and that cannot be quickly reconstructed. When Linear B disappeared, the administrative knowledge encoded in it, the specific techniques of resource allocation, labour organisation, and surplus management that the Mycenaean scribes had refined over centuries, disappeared with it. When the classic Maya writing system ended, the astronomical tables, the mythological narratives, the historical records, all of it became inaccessible until modern epigraphy recovered the ability to read the glyphs. The knowledge was there, carved in stone, but without the key to read it, it was effectively lost. In the modern world, much of our most critical knowledge is stored in formats that are even more fragile than stone. Digital storage degrades, magnetic media loses coherence within decades, optical discs delaminate, hard drives fail. The formats themselves become obsolete faster than the physical media decay. Try reading a 5¼ floppy disk from 1985, assuming you can even find a working drive. The knowledge encoded on that disk is, for most practical purposes, gone, even if the disk itself still physically exists. The problem is not new. The problem is the same one the scribe in Alexandria faced. Knowledge persists only as long as the chain of transmission remains unbroken. Break the chain, and the knowledge becomes archaeology. Some efforts are being made to address this. The Svalbard Global Seed Vault, buried in permafrost on a Norwegian island in the Arctic Ocean, stores duplicate samples of seeds from crop varieties around the world, a biological backup against the loss of agricultural diversity. The Long Now Foundation's Rosetta project is attempting to create a durable archive of human languages, etched on nickel discs designed to last for thousands of years, readable with minimal technology. The Memory of Mankind project in Austria is archiving texts, images and data on ceramic tablets stored in a salt mine, a medium and location chosen for maximum durability. These projects recognise the problem, but they are small, underfunded, and operating at a scale that does not match the magnitude of the knowledge base they are trying to preserve. The resets teach a specific lesson. Continuity is not guaranteed. The thread of accumulated knowledge, the institutional memory that allows each generation to build on the work of the previous one rather than starting from scratch, is fragile. It can be cut. And when it is cut, the recovery is slow, painful, and incomplete. The seventh civilization is not immune. It is larger, more technologically sophisticated, and more interconnected than any previous human society. But those features are sources of both strength and vulnerability. A globalized system can distribute resources efficiently, but it can also propagate failures rapidly. A highly specialized knowledge base allows extraordinary achievements, but it also creates single points of failure. A society dependent on complex technology can accomplish things no previous civilization could imagine, but it's also vulnerable to disruptions that a simpler, more dispersed society could absorb. The woman on the South African coast 75,000 years ago survived because her community was small enough and simple enough to sustain itself on shellfish and coastal plants when the broader ecosystem collapsed. A modern city of 10 million people cannot do the same. It depends on food imported from hundreds or thousands of kilometers away, on water pumped from distant reservoirs, on electricity generated in centralized plants and distributed across a grid that fails if any critical node goes down. The resilience of small scale and the fragility of large scale are two sides of the same trade-off. There is no single answer to the question of how to prevent an eighth reset, but the historical record suggests some principles. Redundancy matters. Systems with backups, with distributed rather than centralized critical functions, survive shocks better than optimized systems with no slack. Preservation matters. Knowledge stored in durable formats, in multiple locations, accessible without requiring complex technology, is more likely to survive a disruption than knowledge stored in fragile or proprietary formats. And perhaps most importantly, awareness matters. A civilization that understands it is vulnerable, that knows the pattern, that has studied the mechanisms by which previous societies failed, is better positioned to avoid the same failures than one that assumes its own permanence. The sky is clear tonight over the plateau where Göbekli Tepe lies re-exposed to the air after 11,000 years underground. The stars are the same stars the people who buried this place saw, moving in the same patterns, marking the same seasons. The people are gone. The knowledge they encoded in these stones is partially recovered, partially lost, a fragment of a tradition that ended when the world around it changed too fast to adapt. The stones remain because stone is durable. The knowledge remains only because we have learned slowly and incompletely to read it again. That is the condition of the seventh civilization. We are readers of fragments, inheritors of a record that is mostly missing, builders on a foundation we did not lay and do not fully understand. The resets are behind us, written in the layers of ice and ash and abandoned stone. Whether there will be an eighth reset and what will survive it if there is, depends on what we choose to preserve, how we choose to build, and whether we learn the lesson the previous 6 attempts have written into the ground. The lesson is simple. Nothing lasts unless it is maintained, and maintenance requires memory. Over the last 2 hours you have heard about 6 moments when the chain of memory broke. 6 times when civilizations that had accumulated knowledge, built cities, developed writing, organized complex societies, and believed in their own continuity were interrupted by forces they could not control and did not survive intact. The Younger Dryas and the burial of Göbekli Tepe, the aridification of the Sahara and the end of the Green Sahara cultures, the floods that covered the Mesopotamian plain and the Persian Gulf basin, the Bronze Age collapse and the 4 centuries of Greek illiteracy that followed, the Maya collapse and the silence of the southern lowland cities, and the Toba bottleneck, the closest humanity has come to extinction, written in our genes and in the ash layers of 2 continents. These were not inevitable. They were contingent, the result of specific combinations of environmental stress, population pressure, systemic fragility, and bad timing. But they happened, and the fact that they happened is the evidence that they can happen again. The seventh civilization, our civilization, is not special in any ontological sense. It is the current attempt. It is more complex, more powerful, more knowledgeable than the previous 6. It is also more dependent on stability, more vulnerable to cascading failures, and more exposed to risks that operate at global scale. The story of the resets is not a story of failure. It is a story of survival and rebuilding. Every reset was followed by a recovery. People survived, communities reformed, knowledge was rebuilt, sometimes from fragments, sometimes from scratch. The fact that we are here, that the 7th attempt exists, is proof that the human species is resilient. But resilience is not the same as permanence. The resets also prove that complexity is fragile, that what is built can be unbuilt, and that memory, the thread that connects one generation to the next, is the most valuable and the most vulnerable thing a civilization possesses. If you're still listening, the night is quiet, and the information has washed over you in the way it was designed to. There is no need to remember every detail. The details are there if you want to return to them. What matters is the pattern. The pattern is, civilizations are not permanent, the chain can break, and when it breaks, the people on the other side of the break have to start again, carrying whatever fragments they manage to hold on to through the chaos. We are the 7th attempt. The question is whether we'll also be the last, or whether somewhere in the future an 8th civilization will dig through the layers we leave behind and try to read the fragments we preserved, the way we are reading the fragments left by the 6 that came before. The stars are still there, the stones are still there, and the memory for now is still intact.